welcome to another edition of Reptile Fight Club. Today we got a special one for you. We got our guest, Paul Bertani, and we'll be talking about some interesting things. So we got Chuck here with me.
Hey, how the hell y'all doing?
Whoa, there we go. Bringing the energy.
Yes, it's gonna be a good fight. So I wanted to bring high energy right off the top.
All right, sounds good, man. Well, you got anything cool to talk about up front, or you?
No,
things going? Not at all.
No.
Okay.
I'm excited for this. Let's get Paul on. Let's get
I just have one thing.
Do you?
Yeah,
right.
Just one thing I'm excited about. I just laid out the first chapter with images for the book for the second edition of the Complete Carpet. So I'm pretty excited about that. Getting excited to get this thing out the door and get it published. So I guess that's one step in the right direction. Hopefully we'll get the rest of the figures laid out fairly quickly, although it's a tedious process. It's kind of mind numbing, but it is fun to go through all the images we have. We got some really top quality images of some cool locality stuff. So shout out again to all the contributors to the book. And if you got any cool, rare things that have to do with carpet pythons, Owen Pelly's, rough scale pythons, shoot them over to myself or Nick, and I'm sure we can find a place for them in the book if they're cool. So
nice.
Getting excited to have that off my plate. But yeah, it's
for sure. I bet. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited too. So I guess the public at large here is not going to know until later, but we're planning on hooking up at the Anaheim Super Show. So I think the last time I spoke, I said it was in San Diego, and I'm an idiot who doesn't pay attention. And so I went back and I was like, oh wait, this is not San Diego, this is Anaheim. And so I'm 45 a couple days after that this coming weekend, and so I said, like, dang dude, I'm going up there. I'm gonna max it out for my birthday, and Justin. I talked to Justin and he was coming along. So I'm really excited for that. We're going to try and do a live broadcast there. So you guys will kind of probably, hear about this before you hear that. But I'm excited to get up to Anaheim with my buddy and have a good old time. So, yeah,
if you're at the Anaheim show, find us, fight with us. We'll have some topics we'll bring up and try to get some people on from the attendees or the vendors or whoever. So it should be fun.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that. That's going to be a good time. So
good time.
Yeah. Old Steve Sharp's going to fly or come in on Sunday and hang out with us as well. So that'll be cool. Maybe get the band back together.
Get the band back together for sure. Yeah. All right. Well,
cool.
You ready to get into this?
Yeah, let's bring Paul on. So
cool.
Paul, how you doing? Thanks for being on.
Hi guys, thanks for having me. Appreciate you guys bringing me on, and looking forward to the Fight Club here.
Yeah, heck yeah. So why don't you tell us a little about yourself, how you got into herpetoculture, and kind of what your lane is in herpetoculture.
So, I guess my story is going to be not so dissimilar from the other people you've had on, and I realize that there's got to be someone with a unique story, but I guess we're all kind of similar in this regard, right?
Yeah.
So when I was a kid, my first animal was a green anole that I caught at a pet shop that was like loose, and that kind of kicked off the snowball, so to speak, that just grew over time. Mm-hmm. And then got my first snake, which was a ball python, like probably everybody else's. And then but this was back before the internet was like a big deal, and so you had like Reptiles magazine was like and encyclopedias were like your only outlet. So I remember seeing a piebald ball python for the first time, being like, whoa, that's so cool. And now you can buy them for $200. So it's just kind of weird, like how things progress, like from when I was a kid to now being an adult. I've been keeping reptiles for decades now. My professional training is in engineering, so it's not really related. That just kind of helps to pay the bills, but it has become tangentially related now with kind of the innovations in equipment and lighting and like a lot of the mechanicals and electronics that kind of help to either create an artificial environment or to control daylight or day night cycles and stuff of that nature. So that's been kind of helpful in that regard.
Cool.
But then recently Everybody kind of has their choice species. Been keeping eastern indigos, green trees, and maybe my personal favorite, the tokay gecko. I really like those, even though they're kind of mean sometimes, but they calm down after a while.
Yeah.
And then like everybody else, you frequent the Facebook for a little while, and then you get fed up with it, and then you kind of go back to your own collection. Then over time, you kind of build up a community of friends, that you call to talk, snakes or whatever's going on in the hobby or something like that. And then relevant to the episode at large. We also have started the RAPS organization, RAPS standing for the World Reptile and Amphibian Preservation Society. And that's become a very interesting endeavor. It was put together kind of originally, by a bunch of people who shared, kind of a similar outlook on the state of the hobby at large, so to speak. And if I were to kind of distill that or focus it down into like a single focal point, it kind of asks the question, like, can we as a collective work together to improve the state of reptiles and amphibians worldwide? And, who's we when I say that, right? So we being the private hobby or herpetoculture, it being zoos, it being conservation organizations, it being wildlife agencies, because this has become, kind of a mixture of a lot of different facets. So you have the hobby, which has, aspects of, breeding rare species, dealing with morphs has become one of them. You have what I'm going to call ecological messes, like down in Florida, you have invasive tegus and green iguanas. And now these are all being tackled by different organizations with different aims. But realistically, if we were to look at it, logically, you would say, okay, each of these kind of, I guess we'll call them stakeholders, would benefit from the collaboration of one another. So like if you wanted to, track tegus, or if you needed, money or whichever, like if you wanted to keep people from releasing those, if you wanted to educate people, as to why this is such a big problem, like both of those can or all of those avenues can be, mitigated by each party, if that makes sense. And so the idea is, let's take a whole bunch of people who are like-minded, and we'll start out with a whole bunch of tenets and say, okay, the foundation of RAPS is going to be like basically 6 pillars, education and outreach, awareness, in situ conservation, ex situ conservation, working with, rare and dangerous species, and then working with and assisting zoos and other organizations. And, in this particular case, you guys are, the episode is stud books. So in that case, you're looking at, how are stud books relevant to the hobby, and how can they be used to either keep track of animals that might be, very important from a species standpoint, or can you make, how would I put this, a conservation relevant population using the hobby, i.e. the Invisible Ark episode, which was a great episode you guys did. For anyone who's listening, I would highly recommend listening to the episode. I thought it was really good.
Yeah, thank you. That's been one of the ones that we've gotten the most feedback on, and people really enjoyed that. So yeah, thank you.
That one was great. And so I guess without giving away too much, I'll wait for the actual fight to start before I kind of talk about the pros and cons of kind of that approach.
Sure. Yeah. So we're kind of delving into new ground here, where we just have one guest. So we're gonna have one of us be a moderator, and then the other will fight you. So we're gonna flip a coin to see who gets to fight you.
See who gets to fight me.
Yeah. So we'll get the coin toss here between Chuck and I, and we'll see who gets to moderate. And
well, I know it's a double coin toss. Yeah, I know. You already know what's going to happen. Is that what you're saying, Paul?
I was saying, yeah. Chuck's just going to lose. Like.
Yeah. All right, you ready to call it, Chuck?
Yeah. No. Yeah. Go ahead. Heads.
Okay. Heads. I'm sorry, it's tails.
Of course it is. See? Of course it is.
That's the way it goes here. Well,
yeah, I'm not going to make a dramatic show about it this time. It just is what it is.
Well, I like to debate, so maybe I'll give you the moderator role this time. If that's
I'll moderate. I want to, I definitely like to
keep us in line.
Yeah, sometimes it shouldn't be me doing all the hard work around here. You know what I mean? You know what I mean?
You're good at cracking skulls.
I don't know. It's tough cracking your skull, dude.
I've got a pretty thick skull.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to talk about the topic of implementing or using stud books in herpetoculture. You know, so it's done very commonly in zoos, and you know, I guess maybe broadening the topic out a little bit, we could include, you know, care guides or SSPs, that kind of thing, but they all kind of function to a similar end, I guess. So we'll talk about kind of the pros and cons of that. So we'll flip a coin for who gets, you know, kind of for that idea, and maybe the person who's the con side gets to look at different pitfalls that may be issues relative to establishing such things.
And I would definitely just say, feel free to flush some of the terminology and some of the ideology about this out for those people who may not be familiar with, you know, kind of zoological practice and stuff like that. So
yeah. Which, I mean, I'm not that familiar with it, but I'm sure Paul has a better grasp than I do.
Yeah, I was speaking to Paul. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Exactly.
gotta watch my rhetoric here.
Yeah, I guess every area has that. You know, they're different terms that they use that maybe the layperson doesn't understand as well, or people who are not in that. I'm sure that's very common with engineering and virology.
I was going to say pretty much every academic discipline has its own like nomenclature of sorts. And I know, I mean, I'm sure the AZA and zoological institutions will get brought up here, and just they really love acronyms, so like those need to be flushed out.
AZA
just by
and
yeah.
All right.
I should probably even say what AZA means. So
okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say AZA is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. It's the biggest zoological organization in the United States. Yeah. Just for anybody who doesn't know.
And they, the different zoos desire their accreditation, right? That's kind of, they want to be a part of that group. And so
there's AZA is the biggest and generally considered the quote unquote best, depending on who you talk to. There are other ones like the ZAA is another common one. The zoological, I don't actually even know what it stands for. Zoological Association of Aquariums, maybe. But they're kind of the second one. And depending on which state you live in, usually dictates which accreditation you either need or, you know, which one you're going to go for. Now, some institutions are dual accredited, i.e. both of them. But oftentimes, like if the state, like as an example, like Ohio will allow both accreditations, whereas other states may say you have to be AZA or you're not, like a quote unquote certified zoo. Whereas, you know.
And some zoos or I guess they maybe call themselves zoos. I don't know what the proper term is, but you know, roadside attractions or something that have a bunch of reptiles that may not be AZA accredited. You know, they're just kind of
sideshows.
Or I mean, they can be fairly big too, but maybe more of the private area.
Big
whereas like somebody that wants to get state funding for their zoo probably needs to be AZA accredited, I would think.
I think whenever commerce comes into the equation, like if you're going to charge guests, if you're going to have guests, you know, interacting with any sort of exhibit, you know, especially an animal, there's normally an accreditation involved. I think the bare minimum is probably a USDA certification. So like people can get a USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. I think that's right. Like they'll have like an exhibitor's permit. And so like you get that, and then you're allowed to like show animals to the public, you know, for education or display or, you know, entertainment or whichever purpose. So it's probably, if I were to tier it, I don't know if this is actually right, but you have USDA, and then you'll have above that is a zoological accreditation. I suspect that the smaller ones are probably ZAA accredited and probably USDA accredited. They may also be AZA. I'm not an expert on, you know, the prevalence of these accreditations. I just know that they exist.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into it. We'll do the coin toss. You can call it, and we'll see which side you want to take. So here goes.
Should I just have Chuck call it, and then I pick the opposite?
No, don't do that.
All
What did
right.
you pick? Heads, so I'm gonna pick tails.
Okay, tails. It's heads. I just have the luck. I don't know
You
what the
might, I
deal
guess
is.
you might as well have let me call it. I mean,
Yeah, I should let you call it, man.
see, but the fact that everyone who loses up against Justin makes me suspicious now.
See,
Well,
I
I try to show it here. We can see each other, so we can see the coin toss. But
I
yeah,
see you. I see you. I didn't see a coin. I saw nothing. I saw
just
nothing.
assume, like,
Failure.
whenever
Failure.
Chuck is around, like his aura makes everybody else guess wrong. Like that's
Yeah.
my assumption.
That's I think that's either that or Justin is a liar.
That doesn't seem as probable as my
No,
words.
I know. That's why I
All right. Well,
I gotta explain this away somehow.
I think I'm gonna take the con side. So I'm gonna maybe discuss the pitfalls associated with establishing those in herpetoculture. So I'm gonna be the negative Nelly this week. So I'll give you the pro. So
I get the pro.
and I'll let you start.
You're deferring to me. You're so philanthropic. So I guess when we're going to start with talking stud books, maybe we'll talk about the scope of it first. So I guess we'll start maybe small, and then we can kind of work our way out, and the pros and pitfalls will be dynamic as we kind of spread the circle, or so to speak.
Sure.
So if you're talking small, right? Like let's say you have a relatively small group of people or small organization, then the pro of the stud book obviously is that you have a lot of control. So you know a lot of the people, you have kind of like predetermined integrity, which is going to kind of determine the quality of the stud book to begin with, and you kind of know everybody, so to speak. So if you're picking, we'll just pick an arbitrary species, we'll say ball pythons. If you have, X number of those, let's say 50 animals, and then you give each one an ID, and they're recorded by, facility, sex, location, maybe morphological or genetic traits, and then you can say, okay, like I have, one animal, and if I want to breed it to someone else's animal, do I have something that's compatible with that, or does someone else have, compatibility with that? And so, like looking at it, I guess from a zoological standpoint. So zoos run stud books, and maybe this is kind of an advocacy for their use to begin with. Zoos use them, conservation organizations use them. Even the AKC or American Kennel Club, has stud books. Like almost any organization that's looking at commercial breeding of animals will utilize a stud book. And so usually a stud book is employed when you're trying to keep an inventory of animals, a la tracking them, and also when you're trying to preserve genetic diversity. So a lot of times stud books are centered around the idea of coefficient of inbreeding, which is kind of the reverse of genetic diversity. So like you may be trying to keep a limitation of coefficient of inbreeding less or minus, let's say 2% or 5% or whatever it may be. So the AZA stud books, for example, they have 3 different classifications. So they have red, yellow, and green. Red is any population or any stud book with a population of animals across facilities of 20 or less animals. Yellow, I should probably talk a little slower for the viewers. So yellow is 50 animals or less. And then green is the so-called highest classification. And that has greater or equal to 95% diversity over a period of 100 years. So that's the largest spread. And so I don't know what the parameter they're looking at is, like if they're trying to keep coefficient of inbreeding below 2% or 5% or what the cutoff is. But usually there's some sort of limitation, and then that allows you to breed a genetically diverse population over time. Now, in the private area, so to speak, if you look at the way AKCs design things, that's a little bit different than how a reptile stud book might be kind of envisioned or imagined.
Yeah.
And that's because they have such a large family tree. You can go back, generation after generation, and you can say how many common ancestors does this animal have, and it makes calculating coefficient of inbreeding much easier. Zoos can do similar things because they probably have, a stud book going back 20 to 30 years. Whereas now let's relate it to the reptile hobby as it exists today. If someone has 4 generations, you're already kind of impressed, right? So like, and most of the time you might get pictures of the parents in that, or the pictures of their parents.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to employ that, in the reptile hobby, I should be careful that I don't enlarge the circle prematurely here. So in a small group, I guess I'm going to distill this down to 2 areas. In a small group, it really serves to basically keep track of animals and to kind of have some sort of database, so you know where these animals kind of, where they came from and any information about them. As the quote goes, the faintest ink is sharper, or is better than the sharpest mind. So anything that is written down is more likely to persevere than something that someone's just remembering.
Yeah. Well, in regards to that, so I guess the pitfall or the challenge I see with that is a lot of times we don't know where the animals are coming from for sure. It's like they get shipped to a certain place that's easy to export from, and then they slap that label onto them. So there's already 2 labels before they even arrive in the United States. Where they maybe originated from, which may or may not be recorded, and then where they are exported from. And then when they get them here, you have the different, some of the dealers may not be necessarily upfront. They might slap another label on it based on what's more popular right now. And so already you're potentially have 3 different labels for the same animal that, may or may not represent actually where it came from. And so, that's probably one challenging aspect of this is having that record of where the animal's from and tracking that, whether or not that's that critical or not. I mean, as long as you've got the species correct, maybe that's what's most important. But that's something to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about this, right?
Yeah. So, and this again, kind of coming back to the scope of it, is, and maybe it's prudent to say, what is the objective of the stud book? Maybe start with that kind of, assumption. Yeah. And you can look at it a couple ways. So in the hobby, localities are I would say a reasonably large phenomena, depending on what species you're looking at. So like carpet pythons, localities are stressed. Scrub pythons, hognose snakes, they have localities of, like, there are lots of locality animals, reticulated pythons, etc.
Yeah.
Now,
and down the road, those different localities could actually become different species if somebody does the taxonomy work. And so it could be a lot more important than just locality. It could come down to future differences in species if the right work is done.
But that's a muddy thing though, right? You're talking about potentially a long period of time and work that needs to be done around that before taxonomically they divide those, right?
Sure, but the point is they could be split down the road. Sure. So if you're interbreeding a lot of different localities, you're gonna muddy up the waters.
Point taken.
Okay.
So taxonomists are fickle, right? Like there's things are reclassified all the time, and something that may have been determined genetically distinct from something else, may be held, it may be reversed. It depends on how things are kind of play out.
Yeah.
But going back to the focus of the scope of the stud book, it depends on the organization and it depends on the objectives of said organization. Mm-hmm. So like you said, in an ideal world, it would probably be that once the stud book is kind of created or conceived, or people agree, okay, we're going to make a stud book for species X, we're going to say that only animals that are from known either GPS coordinates or locations or whatever will be included in the stud book. And in that case, you have, this idea of, we know where all these things are from, so we can preserve animals from, location X, Y, and Z. And in that regard, you can kind of preserve that. Of course, this requires, the integrity of the members, keeping the stud book so that somebody doesn't, insert, let's say, a commercially more valuable animal in there and say it's, locality X, because, it fetches more money. Now, from a zoological standpoint, sometimes this is not considered meritorious, in that a lot of times they're just looking at current classifications of species and how genetically diverse can we keep them. So we'll say, reticulated pythons, they hail from Bali, Indonesia, or sorry, not Indonesia. They hail from Bali, Malaysia, Sulawesi, Sumatra, etc.
Yeah.
So, a lot of times keepers will look at these and consider those almost distinct species, i.e. Bali will be tried, you'll try to breed Bali to Bali, Malaysia to Malaysia, etc. So you preserve the locality. Mm-hmm. And zoos don't generally do that. They treat a reticulated python as a reticulated python. We do not care if a Bali is bred to a Malaysia or a Sulawesi or whichever, as long as genetic diversity is preserved. So their entire objective is to preserve genetic diversity over a long period of time. And, the rationale for that is, kind of apparent in that basically what they want is they want a robust biological pool of animals over a long period of time. So they basically just want to say, let's breed, and this might even be a facet of it itself, is let's breed in effect for health. Looking at the idea that inbreeding is generally bad amongst a population, even though the reptile hobby has kind of run the other way with that in some respects.
So kind of to your point then, Paul, like maybe localities aren't even really a consideration when you're talking about a stud book, right? I mean,
it depends on
with the zoo
objective.
purpose. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I would say. I mean, I guess herpetoculture's purpose is, at least largely has been shown to chase morphs. And so they're kind of adopting the same strategy as breed whatever has a cloaca. I know Chuck loves that.
Don't do it.
Breed whatever you have to that morph to make more morphs, and that's kind of what everything becomes is a byproduct of morphs. And so, that's a challenge when forming something like a stud book is to, hey, ignore the flashy morph and a lot of money and come, do this, altruistic breeding strategy and be a member of the stud book thing and keep things, locality pure or whatever, statute you want to set.
And in some regards, like, and this just kind of occurred to me, like, morphs are basically born of, humans desiring a particular aesthetic. So whatever, is aesthetically pleasing or pretty or in a lot of cases rare, that's kind of what's bred. And so, looking at this from the stud book and or locality argument, you could almost say like, when you're looking at genetically diverse populations, you're breeding, as genetically diverse as you can, versus the hobby that is saying, okay, let's preserve these localities. And that's not to say that there aren't merits of preserving the locality. It's just interesting that, maybe the hobby is preserving it because either that locality is aesthetically pleasing. So for example, like, if you're looking at carpet
Simpsons or something like that.
Yeah. So like one locality is probably prettier than the other.
Yeah.
So like preserve that locality. It's kind of associated with a general aesthetic or kind of, what's the word I want here? Kind of a gravitas amongst the hobby. So like one locality is cooler, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, it's preserved for that regard. So maybe that's a reason it manifested that way in the hobby, even if, from a conservation or, genetic diversity standpoint, it's still kind of, I guess, meritorious because you're preserving that locality. And so like if you had a genetically diverse population of, Bali pythons, then you'd be preserving that locality versus just intermixing them. Now, that's not to say that, intermixing doesn't occur in the wild, right? Like there's integrate zones across a variety of species.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on the objective of the stud book itself and the people who are creating it. So, I mean, if you're looking for physiological health, genetic diversity is generally what you're aiming for. But if you're trying to preserve a population or a locality population, then you would aim for that as well. Even if the hobby may be aiming for that just because it's aesthetically pleasing, it still has kind of that, and I don't know if I'm wording this well, but it has that kind of, other aspect of it that would be desirable. So like if you're preserving that or you're holding X number of species from this locality, if those are genetically diverse, then you're both preserving the aesthetic and the genetics of the animal. But it just depends on how you want to design the stud book. And if you look across, zoological organizations, other conservation organizations, each one like has something that they have set their stud book up to desire. So as we've discussed the AZA, theirs is simply genetic diversity. Locality is not an important factor, but for someone else, it may be.
Yeah, I could see that being a contentious matter if you're trying to set up a stud book and you've got a bunch of different opinions of how that should be done or what's important in the hobby, that kind of thing. And what a lot of times the trends in the hobby, may not be long lived. Although, morphs are of course showing to be a little longer lived than I'd hoped, but they're interesting, but it's almost like kind of a sideshow. Whereas, the real deal, the wild type reptiles, that's kind of what should be preserved or what should be, focused, I guess, in my opinion. But I could see that being a contentious issue of what you need to set it up for.
It's interesting, and I think you said this in a previous podcast, with you guys, is if you take a minute to look at the wild locale or the wild aesthetic, like if you take a minute to look at it, kind of the extraordinary kind of takes care of itself. Like it's interesting that we've, let me back this up a little bit. So in the beginning, I took kind of the stance of, I have no problem with morphs, with the exception of some that have shown deleterious physiological traits. But like in principle, I was like, okay, like, if people want to breed morphs, if it makes people like more interested in snakes, if it makes people aware of kind of the world at large and kind of the state of these populations, then, fine.
Yeah.
Over time, I think my outlook, and this is my personal outlook, not the organization's outlook, is that over time I've kind of changed my stance in that I don't think morphs are probably a good thing. Not because, a piebald ball python is bad, per se. If someone breeds a clutch of pythons and gets a few piebalds, some regulars, whatever. And, the piebalds go to somebody who maybe has a little extra cash to burn. And I'm just, picking an arbitrary morph here. And then the others go to maybe a mom who's picking a pet for their kid, or somebody who wants a normal ball python, or whichever clientele, no problem.
Yeah.
The problem is that over time, morphs have become so prevalent is that the morphs are now kind of the norm.
Yeah.
And nowadays,
you can't find a normal ball python almost, right?
It's kind of bizarre. And this kind of was, how would I put, crystallized for me at a reptile show one day. When I went to the show, and, you go across the show and there's, table after table of, ball python morphs, leopard gecko morphs, kind of the standard stuff. But, at the end of the show, people are kind of like, just chatting back and forth. And I happened across a table and a guy had what looked like one of those plastic cake containers, like basically just a circular container with perhaps 15 baby ball pythons in it. And he was basically handing it to anybody who would take it. Like they were basically, disposable.
Yeah.
And that was, kind of an alarming phenomenon to me, because I was like, we've eclipsed the point at which the morphs are going to a niche market. They now are the market. And then relating this back to the stud book idea, when you're breeding for morphs, you're going in the exact opposite direction of the zoo, mantra, so to speak, right? So the zoo is looking towards breeding unrelated animals. And when you're trying to create a morph, you're breeding related animals. So biologically speaking, this is, almost always considered bad. Now, as a caveat, and I'm kind of stealing Justin's thunder here, if an inbreeding event is performed, if that animal doesn't have, deleterious traits that line up. So let's say you have a simple recessive gene and, that gene is, I don't know, it results in a kinked spine or blindness or whatever it might be. The chance of you lining up those genes is higher, but it's not a given.
Yeah.
So a single inbreeding event may not result in what I'm going to call physiologically inferior animal. That's probably a bad term, but
and a good example of that is all the, Australian stuff that was, that has a very limited gene pool and seems to be strong and doing well, as far as that goes. But
you've had a big mixture of animals that have tolerated inbreeding well. I don't know if that's due to the species itself, if that's due to simple luck. And then you have other species that have tolerated it very poorly. So one example,
I think that weeds them out. If you do line up those deleterious genes, they don't last long and they disappear, and same with some of the morphs. I mean, they can kind of limp them along to some extent, but if you have a deleterious morph, they don't stick around very long. So that's, I think, it would be a challenge for a lot of species if you're trying to model the zoo mantra of, getting genetic diversity, because we don't have a lot of genetic diversity, or we don't have access to that genetic diversity like a zoo would, because we can't import from Australia or we can't do this. So it might limit the number of species we could actually work with in that manner. What do you think?
So, I mean, and this kind of echoes, the reason, RAPS was kind of founded to begin with, is that each of these kind of stakeholders has areas at which they're proficient and areas where they can achieve results that the other cannot. So now Australia, doesn't like to export things, generally speaking, pretty much to anybody.
Yeah.
But, if you had, let's just say a private group or a private organization that had a group of snake X, and then you had a zoological group that had another population. You then have a much larger pool of genetics to kind of to pull from, so to speak.
Sure.
And in that same regard, like if you had, I guess, a benevolent group of people that wanted to make I'm going to call it a redundancy population of some animal that were becoming endangered in the wild, or their habitat was rapidly rapidly being encroached upon or decreased, or whichever you prefer. When you're looking at an ex situ conservation standpoint, you're going to need a large number of individuals, and to acquire that population, you really kind of need the involvement of multiple organizations to get kind of the credibility. Otherwise, if you're just a group of hobbyists, given the wide range of quality that hobbyists kind of, I guess we'll call it the space of quality that hobbyists occupy. You got people with extremely professional setups. You got people that have, we'll call it the reverse of that. And since there's no kind of standard there, it's hard to qualify who, or this is gonna be kind of redundant. It's hard to qualify who is qualified to do such a thing, right?
Yeah. Well, you're making points for me here.
Yeah. So
it does turn up the difficulty if you're trying to get a diverse group to line up on the same page.
You know what? At the same time, like I don't remember where I saw this, but there was some guys talking, and I think it was on Facebook, but they were talking about breeding jags and how this one guy had not had a lot of neuro jags, and then he started to get more into morphs, and the more morphs he put into that jag, the more neuro those animals became. So and that's like a big, I mean, we've really kind of screwed with coastals, right, because of jags, and we can't. Our ability to import carpet pythons here, like, isn't that such a great kind of exclamation point on why a stud book in the United States for carpets is super important?
Yeah. I mean, we tried to get one going back in the Morelia Pythons forum days, and it didn't pan out. Nobody really showed that interest. So it's really tricky. And, I guess that's the main thing is, the difficulty in implementing this with people who are kind of in this for themselves, right? They want to keep the snakes they want to keep. They want to breed for what they want to breed for. Don't tell me what to do with my snakes, that kind of thing.
Well, to that point is people will do lineages and they'll tell you like, oh yeah, no, trust me. I know. And it's like, all right, but that's you saying like there's like an independent body verifying or having some kind of check and balance to really ensure what you're saying is accurate.
And I mean, do we have the tools to do that? I mean, I guess, the AKC will use different genetic tests and things. Do we have the means? And I know Ben Morrill's working on some of those genetic tests to show, parentage and things like that. But do we have the means to say, oh, this is for example, a pure coastal, or no, there's some diamond in there? Do we have even the means to demonstrate that, to verify that? So, you can say whatever you want, but, you have to verify it. So are we to that point? I wonder if that's even possible.
So I guess to score some points back for myself, right? So looking at the stud book in principle, I mean, there are tremendous caveats to implementation. And that, depends on the population that is being involved. That depends on the people involved. That depends on the goal of the stud book. Yeah. And so one area, we kind of talked, we'll talk about carpets, for example. There are one caveat, but then one obvious, kind of win if this was successfully done. So the caveat is using existing animals that exist in the hobby. So a lot of times, you might say, this was a pure animal, so to speak. And it might be, but you don't have proof of that. And so if you wanted to have an animal that you could say, this is for sure a Cheney eye or a Bredli or whichever, animal you're looking at, you might have, enough tracing back to the wild where you can say, yes, its ancestors came from, wild caught source, in X. Now, in Australian species, a lot of these were probably illegally exported. So in that regard, it's kind of challenging to prove that, right? Because you're not gonna go back and be like, well, yeah, so and so illegally exported it in 1965 or something like that. So proving that becomes very challenging. But I guess we'll say a but first. So, but if this were to be implemented, one thing it solves is this, and I'm going to call it a phenomena, and people will kind of maybe know what I'm talking about, hopefully. And it is that when animals come in, animals that come in legally or otherwise, especially of rare species, they often kind of evaporate into the ether. So I'm going to say, and that if 10, let's say Boland's pythons come in, maybe those go to somebody, maybe they go to someone somebody knows, but a lot of times they just kind of disappear. And then, 10 years down the line, people are like, oh, well, what happened to these things that got brought in? And nobody knows. And that becomes, rather salient, especially when, you lose the ability to export at, whatever point in time.
Yeah.
So, a good example of that is, big constrictors. So those used to be brought in, in fairly sizable numbers, many years ago. But nowadays, their import got cut off, and now, people are scrambling to find anything that resembles a wild caught individual.
Yeah.
And the same thing occurs in other species. So, that may happen with Boland's someday, in that, Boland's are no longer available. And then, they're going to come in and nobody's going to know what happens to them. If you have a stud book or some sort of organization keeping track, then at least you know where they went. So you'll know, okay, we brought in 20 examples and, 2 died of disease and, 1 didn't make it through transport or something. I'm just picking generics. And then the other 17 are still around and they're at facility X. Now you actually know where they are. There's some sort of, I'll use the word accountability, even though I'm sure that's going to be a can of worms. So you kind of have this system of tracking, which doesn't really exist now for animals that are everywhere. Crested geckos, ball pythons, etc. This starts to matter less. But when you have things that are rare, you might have somebody working in some rural area of America that has a couple examples of these, but everybody thinks they're dead or don't exist in the hobby. So if you have a stud book, which is kind of another word for basically tracking system, then you kind of remove this phenomena, which I think would be a big deal for the reptile hobby. So
what about so I mean we've talked a lot about the exotic species. What about species closer to home where we can potentially get permits, collect from a given area, and have known locality GPS coordinates for the animals we're working with? Seems like that would be an easier area to tackle, and you could get plenty of people that would be potentially interested in that, especially if you're talking, locality corn snakes or indigos or something like that. Texas, you can collect.
And if I could jump in, I mean, do you think that the Australian government would be amiable? Obviously, they don't like to send their animals out of the country, but would they be amiable to send genetic, GPS coordinated genetic data if we could get it to a point to put into a database?
Actually, there was some funding that was done. I believe the original Taylor thesis was the primary purpose was was to determine where the animals came from to prosecute smuggling. And so and that continued under Ciavaglia, the group, that researcher and her colleagues. And they've got, primers and things that I believe are targeted so that they can show where an animal originated from in terms of, East Coast around this area. So potentially the primers and genetic tests are already known to look at carpet pythons in that light to maybe show where some of their now, I don't know what happens when you intermix the different species or subspecies or localities, whatever you want to call them. So that might throw a wrench into having that work well. But
but you could comparatively look at those things. You know what I mean? If you had something that you knew was maybe a subspecies cross or something like that, and you had the data of what a genetically ranged pure animal looks like, you could kind of you may be able to make a fingerprint of what something like that looks like, right? I mean, possible.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as long as the money and the will is there, you can do just about anything.
Sure.
I'm sure Ben could make it happen. He's got the
Let's go,
smarts
Ben.
to do it, right?
Yeah.
But that's probably another aspect of that is to trust but verify. So you could say, yeah, sure, that's great that you've got these animals, but let's run them through, run a shed skin sample and isolate the DNA and look at it, with these primers and see, if that lines up with the story you're telling or the story you were told where your animal originated from.
All right, Paul, I loaded up your howitzer. Hit him. Let's go.
I mean, unfortunately, my genetics information or my genetic prowess is limited. But when you're looking at something like that, there's that avenue's is almost endless, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could take genetic information if you had like you said, the money and the will, which is normally what it takes to kind of do that. Then you could say, okay, let's take a collection of 20 specimens, get whatever relevant genetics information you want from those, and then you could go across the hobby and then do a comparison. Maybe take, I don't know what n value would be significant enough to prove this, but you could take an n value of so many snakes and basically say, okay, here's ones we think are pure, here's ones we know are mixed, and this is probably great fodder for a research manuscript if anybody wanted to do that.
Yeah.
What are the differences we're seeing? Now, I don't know how in depth one would have to be, because this is about the limit of my genetics knowledge. If you would need to do like a genome sequencing to really tease that out, or if you would only need to look at like some subset of alleles to discern that. Would that give you the information required? Now, it's obviously best if you can have, animals from, some location, but because that then, where those come from. But if you're trying to use the hobby almost like the invisible arc you guys discussed, right, then you have to have some sort of proof, both to yourself and to the world at large, to basically say, look at, if you say you're doing, conservation work, or you're keeping this population as kind of like an arc species, then you have to have some proof of that. Because when someone asks you, they're going to say, how can you prove this theory? And, in academia and otherwise, you're going to have some sort of test that shows, the integrity of this animal from a genetic standpoint. And so continuing off of that to the local species, as you mentioned with the local species, you could do the same experiment, right? To do, are the animals we have in the hobby, are those pure? Were they crossed? You don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It does make it a lot easier if animals are available to be collected, because then you could collect the animals, at a time when they're not endangered, they're not vulnerable, before either an invasive species or changing climate conditions have, put them under, higher pressure or more substantial threat. Then that's kind of the ideal, because you know where they came from, they're pure. And like, if you were ever to lose that population, now you have the pure population to actually test from. So at some point, if you look at the sequencings of the human genome, so that used to be extremely expensive. Now it can be done for like $600, I think it is, like as technology increases. So, when it comes to human, medicine or genetic investigation, that's always going to be the primary one. But then that trickles down into other areas. Like, I'm pretty sure there are research papers talking about genetically sequencing of cats and, certain snake species and whatnot. So it's in the research papers, but it's not like a commercially available thing. So at some point, that will probably be available enough that we could do an experiment like that has just been described.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you don't have the stud book or any record of these, then you can't even take the first step. Or if you're interested in making the stud book without some way to actually track these, you have no idea. And as has been explained to me before, like, now if you lose that species outright, then whatever you have of them in existence is what you have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are animals that are captive bred, that are functionally extinct in the wild. An example of that is the Pan's box turtle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's functionally extinct in China, but they're bred in zoos and in the hobby itself. So like, even if that were, an imperfect genetic example, if they're extinct, then that's all you got.
Yeah.
But hopefully
the invisible arc thing, right?
Yeah, that's kind of I can't remember who it was, but whoever put it kind of succinctly, if it's in my living room, it's not extinct, right? Which I thought was a nice way of putting it. So, but let's assume we haven't gotten to those dire straits yet. The idea to actually track all that requires a stud book or some sort of data management system. So if you can't even take the first step towards making a stud book, then there's no way to even look at that. So that's, I guess, since I'm the pro argument, like you really have to have it, but you also have to have the integrity to manage it and the will to manage it, frankly.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's the challenge out there.
I was just going to say, Justin, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, because the will and the to keep those things going. I mean, a lot of times we see a lot of ephemeral aspects to this hobby. People come and go pretty quickly. People lose interest in species and want to work with something novel. And so, people jump around a lot to different species. So, there, I think there are some that are like have a lifelong passion for one group of animals and they stick to that, rain or shine. But those are difficult to find. And so I guess one of the other pitfalls or challenges I would see is how you keep that going over the long term. If the head of the stud book takes off, and you're passing it down every other year, that falls apart pretty quick, right?
I'm going to try not to make anybody look bad here, but let's just say that has happened, right? So stud books have been made and managed in the past, and somebody has left and all that information has been lost, right? It might have been 30 years worth of species management data. And obviously that's a big problem. So, and this again, it kind of comes back to the motivation of the people creating the stud book. Like I'm just going to pound on that point because that's really what's required to make this happen. And so I guess like if you're looking at someone who might theoretically be involved in this, like you need to find somebody who's interested in kind of I'm going to call the ecological state of the animal. So a lot of times, like, maybe people just want to have a pet snake. Maybe they just want to have a pretty snake. Normally I'm not going to, I'm not going to poop on these people, so to speak, or crap on their parade, whichever inelegant phrasing you prefer. But like, if you want to look at that further, like that's also kind of the way people get involved, right? So, at the beginning you'd ask, what's my background and, how did I get into reptiles and whatnot? So like, I mean, my first snake was a ball python. When I was a kid, I thought piebalgs were super cool. Yeah. But then as you grow up and you kind of evolve and you kind of look at the way, kind of the way things are going, you kind of look at that and say, okay, like, my passion for reptiles and amphibians or, working with those species was born of this, but maybe it doesn't need to stay there because you've looked at it. And also like back then, the reality of morphs was very different than it is today. But, that was kind of where a lot of this started, the ball python, the morphs, I also like I said, the internet was in its infancy then. So like I had a lot of encyclopedias, so you could, and that was like the only basin of information that you could find out about, a green tree frog or a red-eyed tree frog or, a tuatara or, whichever species you're looking at. So I guess you kind of have to have a group of people that's going to look at this and say, do I really care about the state of this animal in the wild? Like, am I invested enough in this to be in it for the long haul? And then like looking at the hobby as a whole, because I mean, I know everybody kind of thinks of this, is what does the future of the hobby look like? Like, can we keep going on the way things have been going? Like, can we persist in the same state? Or are we going to have to evolve and adapt like most people has if the times have changed? And, can we take the hobby or some subset of the hobby, which is most likely, and can we kind of evolve it into something that has greater reach and a greater impact? That's kind of the idea. Like, can that be done? Yeah. And then that, like the answer to that question then hinges on whether or not a stud book is realistic or not.
I would hope that was possible. I mean, I want to see that happen, but I'm a little pessimistic because I think we're still trapped largely as a hobby in the idea of I'm getting in this to make money off reptiles. I think we all come in like with a love of reptiles and, maybe a simplistic outlook. And then it seems like the next step is for us to convince our friends and family to invest in reptiles, and get this species that's worth a lot of money, and this morph that's really cool looking. And if as long as we're trapped in that multi-level marketing idea of herpetoculture, it's going to be very difficult to get into more real areas, I think. And I think that's one of the major impediments is, again, that we're in this for ourselves to make some cash, but I would like to see it change where we each keep a species to, just to keep that species going. I've I heard this a while back. I think I can't remember who it was at this point, but they said, work with something that's not commercially viable, that's imported and considered a throwaway animal, and just appreciate it for what it is, not for what money it can make you and things like that. So if we can get to a point where we have that attitude a little more prevalent in herpetoculture, I think that stud books will be very successful. But until that time, I think that's a major pitfall right now.
Well, all right, this is gonna be kind of a long-winded answer. So I mean, first I'm gonna give you one point to your side, so to speak, in that the morph hobby, and I've kind of expounded on this a little bit before, but the morph hobby is kind of born of like both an aesthetic preference and like, I guess what I'm gonna call savvy business people have looked at the reptile and hobby and say, this is a good way to make money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they looked at kind of what I'll call the Bob Clark model, right? So in the very beginning, like he was looking at Burmese pythons, and then the first morph, quote unquote, was the albino, right?
Yeah.
Wait, was it Burmese or Retix? One of the two.
Burmese. Yeah.
Burmese. Okay.
Yeah.
And then so that became kind of the start. And then Burmese become big and kind of incompatible with most domestic living. So
Mm-hmm.
he said, okay, what's another species like this? Thus, the ball python. Most people can keep them. They don't have gigantic space requirements. They're relatively tractable. And they're, they've adapted to captive conditions very well. So they kind of saw this model, and I'm sure he's a multimillionaire at this point, and said, I want to be the next Bob Clark.
Yep.
But the problem is that, like I've described, the market is so saturated with morphs now, it's hard to dig out a niche for yourself if you haven't already done so. Like I know that there are, big names in morphs that probably make quite a bit of cash off them, but people trying to be the next, biggest and greatest thing, that's an uphill battle. And also, like, if you're looking at it from the outside in, it's not a great look for the hobby. So, like, if you're an ecologist or a conservation biologist or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife or a zoo, you're going to look at that and say, your breeding program is the opposite of our breeding program. And it's gotten to the point, going back to my cake tub of ball pythons, that these animals are basically disposable. You've basically become kind of like a chicken farm, for ball pythons. You're breeding these for commercial purposes only, yet at the same time, often espousing, these are my pets and, I care for them and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not to say that's everybody. And I realize that if this becomes a job and this is what puts your, food on the table for your kids, I can't really critique that, right? Because this is literally sustaining your existence. But if you're going to look at the stud book, concept and say, okay, how can I imagine this in the way that this is going to do the most good? And so one thing I've told people is a lot of times the way hobbies or communities work is they're founded on social norms. And so if you get into the hobby and you look at the norm and it's, keeping lots of snakes and racks, breeding the next and greatest morph, kind of the thing to aspire to is to be the next morph guy, then that's going to be the norm. That's what you're going to get. Whereas if someone were able to shift the hobby where the norm is, let's keep these animals, but how can I be a force for, I'm going to call it good, but this is my own version of good, so take that with a grain of salt. How can I be a force for good here where my involvement of the hobby either conserves a species or advances the body of research or knowledge on that species? So like, for example, if you're going to work with something that has never been bred or something that there's very little information on, and there's quite a few species that fall into this category.
Oh, yeah.
Your opportunity for, research, your opportunity to become an expert, like if the hobby could shift the kind of the pedestal or the glory to being the person who knows how to work with that species, then that would be hugely beneficial. But that would require a dynamic shift in the social norm. And if stud books were to be, so I'm trying to relate all this back to stud books. So if you were to relate that back to a stud book, you're going to say, okay, I'm now working with these species, but, I'm only one person. And the amount you can accomplish with just one person is limited. I mean, even if you're Jeff Bezos, like even he with infinite basically resources, because he's able to kind of transfer those to others and kind of prop him up, that's how he gets so much done. It's not just him on his own. So in the same vein, if he were to have, like, let's say you're breeding, rare species X, and you have, an act of God, a hurricane hits your house, you have a power outage, a heater malfunction, a fire, is that species now gone? If you don't have a redundancy population and someone else working with those, like that might be it. Kind of like the loss of the stud book. You've now lost literal physical specimens, and maybe all of the work is now for naught because maybe that species is endangered. Maybe you can no longer have access to it. For whatever reason, if you don't have a stud book and lots of people working with these, you don't have redundancy, which is generally, almost required for any large scale operation.
Yeah.
And so if you could make the stud books a thing, that might be an initial driver to move the social norm in this direction. And if that happens, the benefits to the hobby, I mean, even from a selfish perspective are manyfold. One, the hobby gets a better face. So if you have someone who thinks you shouldn't keep snakes for whatever reason, you can say, hey, look at these publications I've been involved in, look at this research I've done, look at how I've advanced, kind of working with these species to the point that, zoos are calling me for advice or reading my papers or whichever you prefer. It looks better to what I'm going to call a non-reptile person or a lay person. Like, look at this philanthropic work I'm doing, or what's a better word? Maybe
it's
benevolent.
It's like non-selfish validation.
I'll go with benevolent work.
Okay, benevolent's fine.
I'm sure there's a better thesaurus word for me there, but I think the idea is there.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have the stud book, like that's kind of the underlying pinning for all of this. So maybe I'm conflating the stud book as this end all be all, which it's not, but it kind of speaks to a larger theme, which is maybe the crux of the argument. If you can get someone to buy into the stud book, maybe they also buy into this mantra or line of thinking.
But you do got to start somewhere. I mean, I think that's kind of your point a little bit, right?
So, I mean, this goes back to the discussion of sourcing animals. So one of the big deals, if you're going to do this in a professional capacity, is you want to prove that the origin of the animal is legal, i.e. legit. And number two, you want to prove that it's a pure example of that species. And in order for those things to happen, practices have to shift. Obviously lots of things are imported legally and lots of things are collected legally, but having documentation of that and having recorded, and kept alongside a stud book would be required for third parties to kind of acknowledge this as legit. And so that to me is a big deal if the hobby were able to walk that direction, because it kind of lends that aura of legitimacy in the same manner that, AZA accreditations or other organizations exist, to give some base level of quality, or I was going to say competency, but that sounds kind of arrogant. The same way that universities are accredited, right? You have ABET accredited universities, and that accreditation means something because it's a minimum level of quality. So if you're going to kind of aspire to have that same level of quality, you're going to have to follow the same practices of people, who've kind of been going down this direction. And one of the ways zoos kind of mitigate this is that zoos operate in a purely gratis fashion.
Yeah.
So that's actually, I'm not going to give you that caveat there, Justin, since I know it's basically a point to your team. But the counter to that is, like I said, if you can get the population to operate in a capacity that is aimed towards genetic diversity, population sustaining, there's a better word for that, but sustaining a population, and kind of these kind of assumptions, then I think it's only a good thing. But there are just so many caveats to get there.
Yeah. And I guess that's kind of what that the next point was going to be was,
I knew it was coming.
Yeah. Is the seeking of money in exchange for reptiles, is it compatible with this ideal? And, I mean, zoos get funding through different things. They get grants, they get, state funding, all sorts of stuff. And they get ticket sales and things like that. So we don't have that resource. So, and I think a lot of people, myself included, keep stuff, and, we breed and sell the offspring so we can continue keeping the stuff we have. Now, I do think there is a world where we can, keep a certain percentage of our collection, philanthropically or benevolently. What's the word you used? We can do that with a subset, I guess. So maybe decide in your own mind, what is my philanthropic? That's not the right word, is it? More like, what's my benevolent contribution?
Your ecological,
yeah.
Your ecological kind of, why are we not finding words today?
Tough to define, right?
Obligation,
but just
your ecological obligation.
Yeah, or contribution. What percentage of my collection am I going to donate my time and resources and basically give away the offspring to continue, having that animal in the hobby, or potentially, if done correctly, as a conservation type project, let's all donate a little bit of our time and efforts and monetary contribution to conserving or just keeping a species for that ideal. I think that's possible, but that's going to be tricky to sell people on.
Well, and I also think we have multiple niches in this market, right? So just because morphs exist doesn't mean that, animals that come from a stud book and that can ultimately potentially help AZAs and help keepers and help biodiversity can exist also, right? So we always like to talk about things as an all or nothing, like we're either going to completely screw up the genetic diversity of everything because of morphs, or we're gonna create this stud book and this organization or this structure that is going to completely ensure the captive viability and genetic diversity across all species, right? Like we're very rigid in kind of the polarizing way we talk about things.
Yeah. And that's,
I mean, not me, but some people are.
and I think
never Chuck.
No, never me.
We talked about this in the context of working with zoos in the past, when we talked with Ryan and Steve about we need to maybe potentially adopt more practices that AZA institutions utilize, and definitely stud books are one of those things. But I think hand in hand with those, biosecurity,
that's a can of worms if I've ever heard one.
keeping things as genetically diverse as we can, things like that, where we consider the quality or health or well-being of the food items, like a zoo might. That's something that most keepers don't even give a second thought to. That was kind of a new phenomenon or idea for me, is the welfare of food species is pretty big with zoos. Even like, if you got a thing of earthworms, they need to be checked on every periodically to make sure that their welfare is being kept in mind. So something that we don't necessarily think about, but would be a thing. I mean, life is life, and if we value the life of a snake, why don't we value the life of a worm or a cricket or a spider? I don't know how that's feasible to check on a colony of cockroaches and make sure all of them are happy and healthy, but to make sure that your colony has food and water on a regular basis is kind of a no-brainer, I think. But some definite challenges to implementing these things, but I do see an avenue for everybody to kind of contribute, not necessarily converting their whole system, wholesale over into, maintaining a stud book, but a part of their collection could be dedicated to maintaining a stud book, and not to necessarily gain monetarily from it, but to do better with that species.
Hey, and listen, I don't want to go all Kevin Costner on you guys, but if you build it, they will come. You know what I mean? There has to be, something has to be there. And I believe that, I've talked about this in the evolution of the keeper, right? People get in for whatever reason that gets them in the door, but as they grow and as they learn, they become, they become a better, stronger keeper. And I think in the end, when they're starting to learn about natural history and species and evolution and ecology and all these things that are kind of up higher in the once you get in the door, that people are ready for something like a stud book, something like creating diversity and maintaining diversity in a species just to do that, right? So I think you kind of have to you have to create it, but you have to target it as well, right? I mean, can we agree?
So
yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing, I look at the AKC. The AKC gave people who bought AKC registered animals that confidence or whatever, that they were getting something that was as close to what they wanted as possible, or they were getting the real deal rather than some fly by night, puppy mill that was just pumping out stuff that may or may not be what they said it was. I mean, we bought a dog kind of from one of those breeders back in the early days when we were poor and desperate. Heidi wanted a guard dog, so we bought what we thought was a pit bull that started growing long furry hair. It's like, this is not a pure pit bull. This is something, we didn't go the AKC route. Let's just put it that way. But there was some kind of economic benefit for those people to have that AKC stamp on their animals. Now, could we do that with herpetoculture? I don't know if, it's almost going the opposite direction where people want morphs. They don't necessarily want the AKC stamp. They want the morph stamp, that right now. And so until those ideas kind of change more large scale, we're going to have a hard time keeping this going for long term.
Paul, you want to respond to that?
I'm waiting till you guys are done because
no, I'm sorry.
Long-winded answer version 2. Yeah. So I'm going to hit a couple points that you guys have crossed there. But going back to kind of this line of discussion kind of started with does it have to be an all or nothing conservation effort or stud book effort, or however you prefer? Mm-hmm. So I've done a lot of almost like virtue signaling, or a little bit of implying that, it's benevolent if you kind of change to this, way of keeping, and that this is kind of the way everybody should go. Now, kind of as Chuck had said, I'm going to try and delineate this and target it towards different audiences. So talking about, there are two different audiences at play here. One is, somebody who just wants a snake or a pet or whichever. And another audience is people who are kind of invested in the herpetoculture community, people who are invested in its future, people who, kind of go to shows, who are kind of like almost integrated into it as a system. And so, going back to the commercialization, one of the other discussion, in practice, it's certainly possible to go both ways. And in one regard, herpetoculture actually has a unique advantage here, because you're not restrained by, the practices of an overarching organization. In that regard, if you're going off of just, the goodwill of the keeper, the keeper or the owner, then you can say, okay, I'm going to keep, I'm picking arbitrary numbers here, 50% of these animals are going to go towards conservation efforts or preserving the species. I've been saying, I've been kind of throwing the conservation effort or conservation word around a little bit. So we're going to call it, something that might be suitable for an ex situ conservation situation, assuming that it had, appropriate genetics and background. Mm-hmm. So, but in the same vein, you might say, okay, I'm going to, move these gratis, to people who are kind of involved in my project or effort. And then I'm going to take the other half and I'm going to sell those back into the hobby, as pets or somebody, something that somebody just wants to work with. Mm-hmm. And because you don't have somebody with the same principles as the AZA, and this is not a critique against the AZA, they have these principles for good reason. But you can use those funds to either, pay for snake food or, upgrade caging or sustain your practice as a whole. So that's a really nice benefit that you may not have in a professional zoological setup. So, but that requires the keeper to kind of, or the owner to kind of be, I guess I'm use the words, honest with themselves, so to speak, and say, okay, I'm going to devote this much effort towards this project, and I'm going to like sell these back, to pay for, insert expense, which I think is perfectly fine. Because, but with the caveat that it also depends on the species you're working with. If you have an animal that has a clutch of 1 or 2 babies every 5 years, it's going to be pretty challenging to have surplus. But if you have something that breeds every other year and has 30 babies, you probably have quite a few extra at that point. Like once you have those bloodlines established, especially in, reptiles that are generally long lived, you're not likely going to need a whole lot to keep that population afloat. Especially, with, python or boyd species, that have a 20 to 30 year lifespan. Well, they should have a 20 to 30 year lifespan. That doesn't need to be turned over that often. And then kind of looking at the AKC kind of comparison, a lot of times the AKC is used because that breed has a standard. And that standard may be an aesthetic standard or a personality standard. And basically, if you buy an AKC animal, when you look at, the background of that animal, you might be looking for, okay, I'm expecting, we'll use a Labrador Retriever because that's an easy example. They're generally like calm, they have good temperament, they're good family dogs. You may be looking at a bloodline that has, tested OFA hips. So i.e. it has a low chance of hip dysplasia. Or CERF is the organization that certifies eyes. So they might be certified in these, various areas that kind of, they stack the deck in your favor towards getting an animal that's unlikely to have physiological problems or, health issues down the road. And a lot of people look at that and say, I'm willing to pay more for this level of quality. And in particular, like if you're a family, you want something that's unlikely to bite or be a danger to your children. And lots of times these bloodlines have kind of temperaments that they're not guaranteed, but they're more probable than if you went, and picked up some arbitrary dog.
Sure.
And so relating this back to the hobby, obviously, you're not usually breeding for tameness often, but you might be breeding for size, or some other parameter. Now, this doesn't really happen very often in the hobby, but I know that, people do it. You might be doing, blood work or something like that, some way to assess the health of an animal. Maybe you have a line that lays large clutches. Maybe you have a line that, is more long lived. You could breed for parameters of health in that same regard. Obviously, the looking at morphs is generally bred for an aesthetic. And I haven't proven this, nor I don't think anyone's proven this via, legitimate scientific research, but I seem to be getting the impression that, the how would I put this? The more generations of morphs that have been bred and the more genes that an animal accrues that are what I'm going to call mutations or atypical, generally those animals have the most problems. When you have animals that are like, let's say F1 or F2 or animals that have been outcrossed, normally those do a lot better. They're less prone to respiratory infection. They're less likely to get, some sort of deformity. So in that regard, using the stud book to kind of not ensure health, but to breed for it. And this is the whole, lower coefficient of inbreeding genetic diversity argument, is that you could breed for health effectively.
Yeah.
Instead of, some aesthetic. And, from a zoo standpoint, that's what you're going for. Like you're trying to show a healthy example of a wild animal, because the whole idea is, can you take the wild and bring it, into human hands, which is the premise of a zoo, right? Whereas in the hobby, that motivation has changed for better or for worse.
So real quick, and I just want to make this distinction and just say this is the AKCs, we keep bringing it up because they are a good example of a stud book, but what we're talking about is domesticated dogs, which are 100% completely a human domesticated and created and quantified thing. Like we create the standards for those dogs because we bred multiple lines of dogs to create those things. So there's definitely some little differences there. I just think it's a really interesting concept, because if we can do it with something that we took from wolves and created all of the kinds of dogs that are registered in the AKC, the argument that we cannot do it in reptiles, to me, is fairly ridiculous. It's a will issue.
Yeah. I mean, that's been the point I've kind of harped on throughout most of this. I probably repeated myself too many times on that regard. Just kind of wrapping that back into it, the stud book, I think it's not a cure-all. It's not going to solve every problem, but it is a bare necessity for most captive breeding programs. It is a bare necessity for zoos, and it helps track systems. But it's fundamentally intertwined with the will of the keepers and the integrity of the people involved. Because, we didn't really get into this as much, but like, if you make it available to anybody, like, people could fib or people could lie, this is part of the reason that you want to remove kind of the monetary, element of this, because if you have that, you have incentive to lie or incentive to misconstrue. Whereas, if you're a zoo, curator or keeper, then, that's probably your job. There are safeguards, and, the people kind of who are the arbiters of what goes in and out of the stud book are basically conserving this integrity. So if I'm kind of to distill this, like, I think it is something that would encourage better practices in the hobby. And I think it's something that is required if we're ever to kind of like pool, the known specimens of a species. And, it's something that I think would be a good step, but there are many pitfalls and caveats to reaching kind of the optimal incarnation of what a stud book is.
Yeah.
Justin?
But I agree. That this would be a nice path forward and could have multiple benefits on, different levels. And, despite the challenges, I think it's doable as long as you have somebody who's willing to see it through. You got to have somebody that will have the drive and the stick-to-itiveness to see it through. So, I'd like to see it happen. And
stick-to-itiveness, I'm gonna have to remember that.
Yeah, we can.
We're not above making words up here. We really aren't. No,
that's actually a combination. That's a whole phrase almost.
Yeah. That's what we don't mind doing that either.
But I think identifying those pitfalls can help make it more successful, to go through the potential issues that we can expect to have, and to have a plan for those when they arise. That's kind of the idea here. And hopefully, we've gotten some good ideas and definitely some good discussion has come from this debate or fight or whatever you want to call it. So we'll
call it academic discourse.
Exactly. Academic discourse club is doesn't have quite the
not quite the ring.
It is what we're doing. So, but yeah, I think this has been a great discussion, and I appreciate you coming on and chatting with us, Paul. How do we get in touch with you, or how do people find out about RAPS a little more?
So there's a website that's in its I'll call it somewhat prototypical stage, but it's it's the worldreptilesociety.org, all one word. I don't know if you guys have like a little like paragraph or blurb that like this information be put into. And then like if you ever want to contact me via RAPS or in that capacity, info at worldreptilesociety.org will get you there.
Awesome.
And then sorry, I was just going to say then,
no, go ahead. Yeah.
Just looking at the website, you can see some of the people involved, you can see some of the aims, and, I'm working on getting some of the projects we're already involved on up there so people can kind of get a taste for how this is progressing and moving forward.
Cool. Well, and, despite my taking the negative side on this, I'm involved with RAPS and looking forward to potentially being involved with some of these stud book driven projects, and look forward to working with you, Paul. And thanks again for coming on, and best of luck, and hopefully you have a lot of success with the RAPS.
Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it. Chuck, excellent moderating as usual.
I do my best.
All right. Well, this has been another great episode of Reptile Fight Club. And, thanks for listening. Catch you next time.
Keep kicking ass.